In the span of about a week, every single fighter wing that United States Air Force keeps stationed in Europe got the same order. Move toward Iran. Not one squadron, not a token show of force. All three of them at once alongside special operations units. Long-range bombers put on alert, and a wave of medical personnel quietly repositioned to the hospital that treats America's most seriously wounded troops. This wasn't a routine deployment. This was a military bracing for something bigger than what it was already fighting. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what got sent, why it happened this fast, and what triggered this large. If breakdowns like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe, drop a like, and let's get into it. Let's start with the number that explains the urgency behind everything else in this story. According to a defense official cited by Veng News, 17 U.S. soldiers had been killed, and more than 420 wounded since this phase of the conflict began in February. That's the running human cost, sitting behind every decision described in this update. Not an abstract strategic calculation, but a rising casualty count that had reached a point where President Trump was reportedly leaning toward expanding operations after receiving days of briefings from his top national security aides. Here's exactly what got moved. And the specificity of the reporting here matters, because it shows just how comprehensive this reinforcement actually was. All three U.S. Air Force fighter wings based in Europe deployed jets to the Middle East within a single week, according to a defense official who spoke to Veng News, that included F-16 Fighting Falcons from the 408 Fighter Squadron at Spangdahlem, Airbus in Germany and Stealth F-35, Lightning Eyes from the 48th Fighter Wing at RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom, Air and Space Forces magazine, a publication with deep sourcing inside the Air Force itself, confirmed the same specific units and bases independently, along with confirming that aerial refueling tankers were being sent alongside the fighters. Essential support. Aircraft that let fighter jets extend range and stay on station longer during sustained operations. The reinforcement didn't stop at fighter jets. A-24. A-24 News reported that the broader buildup included special operations personnel, additional fighter jets, aerial refueling aircraft, and long-range bombers. All confirmed by U.S. officials and people familiar with the deployment. Specifically, B-1 bombers stationed in Britain were placed on alert, ready to move if ordered. Cargo flights departed U.S. bases used by Special Operations Forces. Units capable of carrying out a range of missions including combat search and rescue. Exactly the kind of capability that becomes critical when American air crews are operating over contested hostile territory where shootdown could mean troops on the ground needing extraction under fire. There's a detail in the same reporting that tells you just how seriously military planners were, treating the possibility of American casualties in whatever came next. More than 150 additional medical personnel were sent to Regional Medical Center in Germany, described as the main facility for treating U.S. troops wounded in Middle East operations. You don't surge that many medical staff to your primary casualty treatment center unless you're specifically planning for the possibility of a meaningful increase in wounded American service members arriving from the theater. That's not a detail military planners include in a routine low-stakes deployment. It's a sign of genuine anticipation that whatever came next could produce real casualties, requiring serious medical care. This specific wave of reinforcements didn't happen in isolation. It built directly on top of an earlier surge that had already been underway. Air News Journal reported on July the 20th that the U.S. was additional F-16 and F-35 fighters specifically from those same European bases, describing the moves as a strategic reinforcement meant to bolster U.S. air capabilities across the entire Central Command Area of Responsibility. Enhancing what? The report called Rapid Response Options against potential threats. Air and Space Forces. Magazine's own reporting confirmed this had been building for weeks by that point, noting the Pentagon had already sent F-15 Strike Eagles to the region several weeks prior to this latest fighter wing surge, with Central Command describing that earlier deployment publicly as enhancing combat readiness and promoting regional security and stability. There's also a specific named location that keeps coming up in coverage of how far this buildup could potentially extend, and it's worth understanding why. Al Jazeera's tracking of the broader military buildup near Iran specifically flagged Diego Garcia, the joint UK-Jews military base in the Indian Ocean's Chagos Islands, as a facility capable of hosting long-range U.S. strategic bombers, including B-2 stealth aircraft. That base has historically served as a launch point for major American air campaigns in the region, but there's an important complication buried in that same reporting. Diego Garcia is technically British sovereign territory. At least Washington, meaning the United Kingdom, has to formally approve its use for any offensive operations. That's a real diplomatic dependency sitting underneath America's own regional air power options, one that isn't always obvious from the outside when people assume American bases operate purely under unilateral American Command. Widen the lens to why this specific buildup happened when it did, because the timing lines up directly with a breakdown in what had briefly looked like a stabilizing period in the war. According to reporting from this same window, Trump was actively weighing expanding U.S. operations against Iran following attacks that had killed American troops, with Desurge, described explicitly as reinforcements, while the president considered his options based on those days of national security briefings. This wasn't reinforcement for its own sake or a generic show of strength meant to deter Iran in the abstract. It was preparation, tied directly to a specific live decision about whether to escalate American involvement, further following a stretch of attacks that had already cost American lives. It's worth stepping back and comparing this specific buildup to earlier military reinforcements throughout this broader Iran conflict, because the pattern of surging air power toward the region has actually repeated itself multiple times since this crisis first began. Back in February, as the initial confrontation was building, flight tracking data had already shown F-35s, F-22 Raptors, and F-16S moving from the continental United States toward American bases in both Europe and the Middle East, alongside scores of cargo planes flowing into Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Bahrain. F-22s and F-35s had also previously flown escort missions for B-2 stealth bombers during Operation Midnight Hammer, the strikes on Iran's nuclear sites carried out the year before. So, this July surge wasn't the first time American air power had rapidly concentrated in the region during this conflict. It was by this point at least the second or third major wave of reinforcement, each one triggered by a fresh escalation in the fighting. There's a genuinely sobering strategic consideration raised by a retired Air Force general around this same period that's worth including because it points to a vulnerability. Most coverage of these deployments doesn't spend much time on. Retired Air Force General Glenn Devan, former head of U.S. Northern Command and ORA, warned publicly at the end of July that Air Force bases inside the United States itself, despite being heavily guarded, could potentially fall victim to the same kind of drone attack that struck bomber bases deep inside Russia the previous year. That's a warning about the vulnerability of the aircraft staying behind on American soil, not just the ones being deployed forward into the Middle East. A reminder that this kind of large, rapid reinforcement effort carries risks on both ends of the deployment. Not just in the contested airspace over Iran itself. Put all of these pieces together and you get a clear picture of just how comprehensive and fast this specific military buildup actually was. Every fighter wing based in Europe committed aircraft within roughly a single week. Special operations forces moved alongside them. Long-range B-1 bombers went on alert status in Britain. Medical capacity at America's primary casualty. Treatment facility in Germany got reinforced by over 150 additional personnel. And all of it happened while the sitting president was actively weighing whether to expand American military operations against Iran even further following a documented rising toll of American troops killed and wounded since the fighting had reignited months earlier. That's the honest answer to why the U.S. military rushed, essentially, every available warplane it could, repositioned toward Iran during this specific stretch of the war. It wasn't a single dramatic order issued in isolation. It was the natural next step in a pattern of escalating reinforcement that had already played out at least once before earlier in the conflict, triggered this time by a documented rise in American casualties and a president actively deliberating whether the next phase of this war needed to look considerably larger than what had come before it. If you want to keep tracking whether this specific buildup translates into the kind of expanded operations that appears to be preparing for, stick around, because a reinforcement is broad hitting fighters, bombers, special operations forces, and medical capacity all at once tends to be a genuine leading indicator of what a military expects to need in the weeks immediately ahead of it. Let me know in the comments whether you think this surge was preparation for a specific planned operation or simply a broader deterrent posture, and I'll see you in the next one.